Good morning and welcome to today's webinar from Arum. My name is Mark Buckley and I'll be your host. This webinar is titled Duty Bound Data-Driven Consumer Outcomes. I'll now hand you across to today's presenter, Stephen Coppard. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, folks. Many thanks for joining us today. So, look, we've only got 30 minutes, so I'm going to crack straight on. I would like to leave some time at the end for questions. Please do pop any, if they occur to you, into the chat. And if we don't get a chance to answer them today, then we can come back to you afterwards. So look, just to set the scene, I'm not a fan of wordy slides. I hate death by PowerPoint, especially when people just read off the screen at you. So the slides are more of a visual aid to the conversation. And this session it is being recorded, so hopefully we'll get it up online in due course. So, very briefly, who am I? Who are we? And what makes us worth listening to? We hope. Arum is the UK's leading independent provider of advisory and professional services within the collections and revenue space across both public and private sectors. We've got over 24 years worth of experience in over 20 countries. And let's be clear, right? All we do is debt. We are specialists in our field and we are passionate about helping organisations resolve problem debt in a way that's fair to everybody. As for me, Steve Coppard, I worked in government debt for over 20 years. I've worked in everything from ops to analytics to commercial, and I ended up running the government's debt management function with responsibility for prompting policy and strategy improvements for over £40 billion worth of debt owed to the government. And after 20 years in government, I thought it was time for a change, and I joined Arum and Just in May this year. Okay. So look, in the spirit of tell them what you're going to tell them, first I'd kind of like to set the context for consumer duty, and not through the stuff that you can Google for yourselves, but through a bit more personal industry insight gained from conversations with a few senior figures in the industry. And then building on those conversations, a look at the risk inherent in the end-to-end process. After that, I want to consider how outcome data can be used to help mitigate some of that risk. And then we'll take a look at how we can use collections data more generally in upstream product design. And then finally, I'd just like to leave you with some other resources, not just stuff that we've done from Arum, but also from across the industry. Okay, if that sounds good, we'll move on. So look, a few months ago, I was mulling over the state of the industry in an informal chat with our managing director, Carlos Osorio. And we were talking about the increasing number of ways that people can get into debt. So things like early salary access schemes, pay by mobile, but buy now, pay later. These are all things that are fairly regularly on my mind. And I made the point that it felt like the FCA was continually having to lock the stable door after the horse had bolted. And what we actually needed to do was to lock the front door and stop the horse getting out in the first place. And look, just on a technical point, I know technically there was nothing that the FCA could do about buy now, pay later. It was a quirk of the Consumer Credit Act meant that it could masquerade as something other than credit. But I figure if you ask the folks who are in debt to it their opinion, I think you'll find that they don't really care what we in the industry call it. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then it's a duck. Anyway, look, the point I was getting at was that if something had existed that put an onus onto firms to ensure that the products avoided consumer detriment, that helped them to achieve their financial goals, and did not drift away from the original purpose of the products over time and deliver good outcomes, then would we ever have had, I don't know, for example, the payday loan market? Even if it had still appeared, I would expect consumer duty to prevent it from embedding itself so deeply into the market. And look, all of the conversations I've been having suggest that the collections sector shouldn't need to worry too much about getting consumer duty right. So I was on a panel debate with John Whiteman from the Financial Ombudsman Service at CSA's UK Credit and Collections Conference the other week. He was saying there that FOS data suggests that the underlying need for consumer duty is further upstream in the retail end of the market. But of course, that doesn't mean we don't need to act in our space, in the debt management space. And in fact, as I'll talk about later, I really think that debt management outcome data has the power to transform upstream product design. So let's touch on principles versus rules, because I know that there's some frustration around the principles-based approach and that a bit more clarity would be welcome. I'm going to wave my flag and say actually that I am in favour of an adaptive principles-based approach over narrow technical compliance rules. And I know that's probably easy for me to say as somebody who isn't an active practitioner at the moment, but I will say that my view on that was formed from experience in ops and transformation, and comes from both public and private sectors. So look, I remember implementing lean in HMRC, and it was the rigid one size fits all product based approach that really placed a straitjacket on teams, and it made them feel as if something was being done to them. And it created automatons who blindly followed the process lest they fall foul of the newly introduced quality managers. And then conversely, on the other side of that, a few years later, I was talking to a director of a big DCA who was telling me about the benefits at the time of treating customers fairly. But what he was saying was that the affordability conversations had gone too far at first, with agents almost talking people out of paying. But through test and learn, they had found the sweet spot for themselves. And that actually, having worked that out, meant that they bought into it more. He said to me, if they'd have been told what to do and they didn't like that, then they probably would have just looked for loopholes. And so what they'd achieved through the principles based approach was a culture change, and that's absolutely what the FCA is looking to do again today. Final thing I'll say on this topic is around principles versus rules is just look at the industry's response to Statutory Debt Repayment Plan. Everyone I've spoken to about it, and I've spoken to a lot of people about it, everyone has said that the rules-based approach, an approach that's devoid of principles, means that it won't suit many customers, and of those that it does suit, many will find it too difficult to follow the rules and are likely to have to exit the plan early. And given that, a couple of businesses I've spoken to are talking about implementation costs of between £2 and £3 million for SDRP, that test and learn approach starts to look more appealing. But look, this is just my opinion, right? And I accept there are probably valid arguments for moving more to a blend of principles and rules. But then it's how do you get the balance right? And look, like treating customers fairly, consumer duty isn't just based on being the ethical thing to do. Firms that provide the best outcomes for consumers, firms that really help consumers to achieve their financial objectives, those are the firms that are going to see repeat business. And ironically, we may actually see the battle of principles versus rules play out if SDRP is implemented as it is. So look, while the solution itself isn't regulated by the FCA, the debt advisors who use it are FCA authorised. And so any solution they recommend will have to meet the terms of consumer duty. In other words, consumer duty could rule that SDRP as a product isn't fit for purpose if it doesn't deliver good outcomes for consumers. I got to say that really appeals to my inner anarchist. Okay, so look, moving on. I just want to say up front, before we delve into this too much, we're seeing a lot more around negative budgets at the moment, to the point that the Money and Pension Service has launched a consultation to find out more about how it can support in that space. And we all know, right, that the negative budgets are no way new. But we also know that the environment that we're working in right now probably means that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So look, credit retailers are going to have to reevaluate their appetite for holding debt, and debt purchasers are going to have to look at their risk models in this changing economy. And I know that they do this anyway. But once we acknowledge that negative budgets are on the up, then consumer duty kind of demands that we monitor for that drift even more. So, for example, if you're marketing a credit score builder credit card, but it just becomes another form of revolving credit that ends up being a persistent debt, then we'll need to be able to provide evidence as to whether that outcome was either A, an inherent feature of the product's design, or B, whether the customer circumstances had changed and that actually that outcome was unforeseeable. So I'd fully expect that stress testing of such products will need to step up in the near future. So just as there'll be outcomes from the product life cycle in the live retail environment, there'll also be outcomes that we can look at from those same products that when they enter the collection space. So as I just said, you could argue that under consumer duty, products that enter collections fall into one or two camps. Those whose arrival in collections couldn't be foreseen, and those whose arrival is an inherent feature of product design. So look, cynics could say that ending up in collections was historically priced into product risk through fees and interest. And we need to be mindful now that if products are priced in a way that makes it evident that ending up in collections was an expected outcome, consumer duty is going to pick that up. In other words, it will force product design to be more ethical, and that's good for the consumer and good for those who already price their products ethically. But regardless, it's about the collections data that is going to become really critical. It will add value further upstream in the chain. So look, just as affordability checks use varying levels of external data to decide on risk in the sales environment, so that same data is drawn upon when we're deciding affordability of repayment plans. And where we're using things like machine learning and dynamic next best action codes, we no longer have that range of prescribed treatment paths. The treatment paths are kind of created on the fly based on the data and consumer behavior. So getting that decisioning engine right can go a long way towards evidencing good outcomes, at least in the collection space. And at present, we know it's pretty common for that data, that outcome data from collections to be fed back into the front end of the collections process to continually improve the customer journey. But with the advent of consumer duty, that data may also hold the key to unlocking continuous improvement in product design. So there's additional value in that data, and that would allow us to reduce the risk of consumer drift leading to cases ending up in collections, so that we can reduce the cost of the product, price it more keenly, and make it cheaper for consumers to achieve their financial goals. So the FCA is advocating a risk-based approach. So we have to identify the areas where consumer detriment is most likely to happen. Now, for me, I guess I think that the entry point to any process, that the front door is the most critical point, because if we get it wrong there, then we run the risk of pushing people through a number of incorrect steps before we catch it and fix it. And indeed, that's if we catch it at all. Not only can that lead to consumer detriment and bad outcomes, it's also likely to end up costing us more because we're just pumping failure demand into the system. So look, there are a couple of things that we can look to here. First is the British Standards Institute, which was recently rewarded for its hard work and achieved ISO status for ISO 22458 consumer vulnerability, which is based on inclusive service design. And then second, it's a narrower scope, but this is still an important product, is that the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute's mental health accessibility standards, which again has universal design principles. So I went to the launch of the mental health accessibility standards back in 2018 now. It's been around for a good few years. And I really like the way that their chief exec, Helen Undy, sort of describes that universal design concept. She compared it to the drop curb in the pavement. So it was put there originally to help people in wheelchairs, but it also helps those with luggage on wheels, with pushchairs and prams, with shopping trolleys. It helps people who are visually impaired to detect the edge of the curb. But the critical factor is that it causes zero detriment to the people who don't need to use it. So the other areas that are worth looking at, and these again are just things that we're considering at the moment. Micro customer journeys would be a good one. So, for example, how many people do you see in your data? How many people start setting up a direct debit but don't finish it? And are you confident that there isn't something in the process that is driving up the failure rate? And look, direct debits are great, right? Self-serve, reliable, consistent, automated. If we're not maximizing the number of direct debits that we hold in, then we're potentially driving up costs elsewhere, as well as making the customer experience clunkier. But another place to look might be our treatment of abandoned calls. And look, abandoned calls could be a symptom of an external problem, right? The doorbell went, or the dog actually was eating the kids' homework. But we've just lost someone who, at least at that moment in time, was willing to engage. And that's a golden opportunity. So are we, for example, automating AI texts or WhatsApps or whatever socials people are using these days, and offering an automated callback when they want? And sorry, listen to me chatting about socials like I'm down with the kids. I'm so not. Other things that can help here. Look, I've already spoken about things like automation, machine learning, differentiated treatment paths, dynamic next best action codes. They're all big topics in and of themselves. And we don't have time to get into them individually in this webinar, but do feel free to hit me up if you want to chat about those. And look, I just wanted to say briefly, I'm aware that one section of the industry that I haven't touched on today, and it would be conspicuous by its absence if I didn't, is credit unions. And it's a conscious choice because I think they're a little bit more niche in their needs. But look, if you do want to know a little bit more about that, the FCA published a Dear Board letter to credit unions recently. I'm more than happy to share the link on that. Okay, so hopefully everyone's still awake. I'll just do a couple of slides left. Some resources that I think you may find helpful. So first, we've got the government's interactive vulnerability toolkit. This was something that my old team in the Cabinet Office developed. And look, you'll probably know all of the tools in there. It was built on the shoulders of giants. And I always have to give a nod to Chris Fitch, who really stepped up in the fairness group when I talk about this. But it is still a handy set of tools in one place. I'd like to think that everybody on this call is more than familiar with the CSA's code of practice, so I'm not going to dwell on that one too much. And then look, I just wanted to give a nod to industry reports. So I've particularly highlighted a step change one there. And the reason I've got that particular one in my head is I was doing a panel debate at GovNet, the GovDebt conference a couple of weeks ago, and get the question out of the audience: does vulnerability mean that people can't pay? And this image from a years old step change report popped into my head. And the point I was going to make is that I've lost track of how much I've learned as a result of reading other people's research. So it really does pay to have folks keeping on top of the ever changing landscape of reports and current thinking that's out there. And finally, it's no sales pitch, just some free resources on our website. So we've got a couple of blogs there. What do you need to know about consumer duty, how to ensure you're compliant with it, and then our white paper on SDRP, which talks about the interplay as well between SDRP and consumer duty. So look, if you want to follow up chat from anything that we've spoken about today, please do hit me up. And that's all, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. We actually have a couple of questions that have come in for you also as well. If anyone does have any questions, please put them in and we'll see what we can do to address them in the last 10 minutes or so. So the first question, Steve, that's come through is, what should firms have considered ahead of Monday's implementation plan deadline?
So look, there was a good article. I think I've got it open somewhere. There's a good article from UK Finance recently, which listed a few things that companies should have addressed by Monday. I can pop the link in, but effectively, resource availability and capability for delivery, governance and oversight, That's the, there's a big push on that to have the senior members of the board engaged and with official duties, collection and the use of data, which we've touched on today.
Yeah.
MI and reporting was another big one. And you're going to need the MI for, I guess, for evidence purposes as well. Target market identification, customer needs analysis, product service design reviews, and risk assessments. So there'll be those of us on this call today who don't work in that section, but like I was saying, the data that we hold in collections can have value for that as well. The ongoing measuring and testing of outcomes for customers, particularly those in vulnerable circumstances. Consumer duty, it mentions vulnerability over 100 times. I think it's baked in. There's no getting away from that. Reliance on third parties and I guess most critically plans for assurance. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to do that evidence based, get the evidence out there, you need to be able to assure that you're doing it. But like I said, it's on that. There's a great UK finance blog on that, Mark.
Right. Okay. So people can find that information there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Brilliant stuff. And the other question that we've received before the end of the webinar was, you said that consumer drift in financial products could lead them to ending up in collections. Do you think we could see drift purely in the collection space as well?
So yeah, I guess if we're talking there about drift within collections as a sandboxed area, so we get drift once the case is in there. Yeah, I guess absolutely. Yeah, I think we're probably better equipped to deal with it in collections though. So look, I spoke about the fact that we use affordability data both during the sales process and in setting repayment plans. And it's always intrigues me that creditors fully accept and. Sorry, Mark. Am I still on? That's
yes.
Yeah. So sorry,
yes.
buddy. I just got a funny noise in my earpiece. So sorry. I'll pick my thread up again. So I spoke about the fact that affordability both in the sales process and in setting up repayment plans. It's always intrigued me that the creditors accept and price in a level of risk regarding future unaffordability at the point of sale. Yet, I guess it probably took the introduction of treating customers fairly for most of us in the collection space to accept that same risk exists on our side of the fence. So in other words, the way we set up long-term repayment plans is unlikely to look the same after a few months of that plan running. And hence we have a check-in point. But if we look at again, let's go back to Statutory Debt Repayment Plan. That's much more rigid, and it doesn't have the flexibility to really respond to people's lives. And let's be honest, people's lives are complicated and messy, right? They don't fit into neat rules laid into regulations and legislation. So if SDRP, for example, isn't changed, we could actually see the SDRP promoting drift first off into unaffordability and then out of the product entirely. But that works the other way around as well. So if people's financial position improve and we don't amend the repayment plans accordingly, then we could be keeping people in debt for longer than necessary. And that doesn't help them to achieve their financial goal of becoming debt-free either. Look, there are plenty of other examples. So off the top of my head, if we're referring people to advice, they enter a breathing space, and then 60 days later, they haven't taken debt advice. They're no closer to resolving their debt. So I think absolutely it does exist within that space.
Right. Cool. Thank you very much, Steve. No further questions have come through. So I think that's a very good endorsement for how concise and informative you've been, Steve. Brilliant. So if people do have questions that come to mind, please don't hesitate to send them through to Steve. His details are there on the screen, or you can send them through to ourselves and we can forward them on as well. That's either way is perfectly fine. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to thank Steve very much for his time. Thank you very much for today, Steve. It's been very informative, as mentioned before. I'd like to remind everyone again that this webinar will be listed on our website from tomorrow if you'd like to listen again, or recommend it to any colleagues who couldn't make it today. Also, before you go, we'd appreciate if you could take a few seconds just to give a little bit of feedback in the relevant area provided as well. That'd be greatly appreciated. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for your time today, and thank you again, Steve. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy your day. Take care.